Good morning. My name is Alpha Huxham. I work for the Sprout base in Cardiff, and I'm here with Mr. Ian Stallion, working for NATO. Good morning.
Good morning to you.
Good morning. So first of all, I would like to ask you, Ian, since starting at the personal level, when and how did you come to join the NATO international staff? And since you have been here, what other positions have you held?
Well, good morning again. I joined NATO 4 years ago now, having had a career in the Royal Navy. I was a submariner by trade, so by profession, commanded submarines, commanded the submarine school. Although the last 10 years of my life working for the Royal Navy were basically in the Ministry of Defence and Cabinet Office, doing procurement work and then moving on to policy work, both submarine related and more broadly. So certainly working in the Cabinet Office, wider policy work than that, working in an international context, which set me up for this job here in NATO. As I said, I've worked here now for 4 years. I've got a couple of years left on contract and the potential for working beyond that in NATO. And my responsibilities here are within the field of NATO's nuclear deterrence policy.
In the context of the broader, not just the military security and defence dimension, would the alliance be strengthened, weakened or unaffected by a British withdrawal from the European Union? And how would you see a British withdrawal from the EU affect how NATO works over the long term?
Well, I'll give you a personal view, and this is very much a personal and not a NATO view.
Of course.
I think it would be affected to some extent. I mean, in simple terms, you could say that NATO and the EU are different organisations. They have to both be in Brussels. They have largely overlapping membership, but actually they were designed to do two different things, certainly from the outset. But I see the overlap over future years becoming more and more, because if we as members of both these organisations want to see a democratic world and want to see the world develop, want to maintain our security within this world that's developing, we have to recognise that there's a place for hard power and there's a place for soft power. And NATO traditionally is the place for hard power, although obviously NATO actually gets into a lot of the soft power side of things, and EU is principally the place for soft power, even though the European Union has moved in the direction of looking at the military side of things as well. So I see the organisations as, if we want to achieve what we want to achieve in the world across the Atlantic, I see the two as actually more and more complementary to each other, more and more working together to achieve that. And obviously there are problems with doing that, although as I said, the membership is largely the same for both. There are discrete areas where some nations are in the EU but not NATO, and vice versa. And there are some political issues there that need to be overcome to enable that whole NATO-EU relationship to work better than it does at the moment. But I see the future as being that NATO and the EU would have to work more closely together to achieve what both sets of nations, both sets of members want. And if UK were to leave the EU, that would cause a bit of an issue with that. It would create waves. It would act as a bar to some extent to working together more closely. So overall, I think that would be probably a bad thing. But as I said, that's a personal view. I'm sure you'll get different personal views from other Brits.
Indeed. Despite the fact that NATO and the EU are separate organisations with different memberships and functions, there has been a long debate about how the two could collaborate more effectively together. What are the main remaining challenges to improve that collaboration, and would overcoming those challenges be easier or harder if Britain were to vote to leave the European Union?
Well, I think I've sort of tried to answer some of that question a little bit already.
Yeah.
I think those nations that are either in one organisation or the other, but not in both, there are some issues there, and with a couple of nations in particular. So there are political issues to overcome. There are political process type issues to overcome to allow that NATO-EU coordination working together to happen better than it does at the moment. But I think we are making progress in that area. And as I said, I think it's essential we do make progress, because to ensure, just security without, ensuring wealth and so on as well, but ensure basic security. I think more and more we will rely on soft power as much as hard power, and that requires NATO and the EU to work together. As I said, for UK to leave the EU, with the UK as such a major contributor to both of those organisations, actually a hole would be created. Our voice would not be heard, and it's not just the UK security that would affect. I think actually others welcome our representation in both, and the balance we bring by being represented in both. So I think not only would it be a poor result for the UK, I think it would be the poor result for Europe, and indeed for the transatlantic security setup as a whole.
Out of the 1,000 or so international staff at NATO, given that Britain and France are two major European military member states, how many British staff are there, and given the debate about the underrepresentation of Britons in the EU institutions, is Britain overrepresented or underrepresented, or is in the proportion of staff per member state just about right in NATO?
Well, I haven't seen the recent figures, the 2015-16 figures for NATO, but certainly a couple of years ago, the UK represented somewhere between 10-12% of the NATO staff. So actually I think that's quite a healthy number, and that sounds about right to me. So I think the UK is actually quite well represented in NATO, and that is a range of ex-armed forces military people like me, policy people that have actually grown up in the NATO structure. You talked to Dr. Jamie Shea before, and he's been here many years more than me. So you can see we represent different sides of that Brit representation in NATO. So I think there's quite a healthy representation in NATO as far as the UK is concerned. And as I said right at the beginning, you could see that purely as isolated, irrespective of the EU, pretend the EU doesn't exist, then on its own, the UK does have a good setup here in NATO, a good broad range of experience. I have lots of colleagues who have a similar background, and lots of colleagues here who've spent longer here, a similar time to Dr. Shea. So there's a good balance in terms of numbers, and I think the UK is pretty well represented here in NATO.
Would British NATO staff be affected in any way by British withdrawal from the EU, and if so, how?
Well, you would think, at first thought they wouldn't be affected, because I said NATO is separate to the EU as an organisation, so why should they be affected? But actually, if you dig a bit deeper than that, I think you'd probably find that there would be effects. I mean, the simple effect that actually there's a fairly sizable British expat community here in Brussels.
Yes.
People know each other in EU and NATO, and actually, in terms of furthering security, we should be doing more so on a professional front, but on a family front, on a socialising front, and the general exchange of views and getting to know people. Actually, there's a big support to the UK community here in Brussels, and if the majority of that is based on the EU, not on NATO.
Yeah.
So I guess if the EU were to go, then there would be NATO people whose spouses would suddenly lose their jobs, whose children they'd be debating whether to move them back to the UK or keep them here in Brussels. There'd be a fall off in the UK community and the support it gives both to NATO and EU staff. So these are kind of intangible things. I think they're difficult to grasp exactly what the arguments there would be. But I think it's not the simple answer that NATO and the EU are separate, so there wouldn't be any impact. There wouldn't be any direct loss to UK jobs here in NATO, but actually some of those second and third order impacts I think will be quite substantial, and it's difficult to think through what those would be.
Especially there are about over 28,000 British expats living in Belgium at the moment, so in terms for each individual family, it really depends on the result, really, what happens.
Exactly. I mean, it wouldn't affect me, because I have a family in the UK and I'm just based here, as a single person that goes back home every couple of weekends or so. But that is not the common case. I mean, there are others like me, but a lot more have family ties here in NATO, and it's quite normal to find somebody who works in NATO and their spouse works in the EU, or vice versa, or who moved from NATO to the EU and then back again as Brits. So actually, the relationship between NATO and the EU, as far as Brits are concerned, is far more complicated than just seeing them as two separate organisations.
The target audience for this interview, as you know, are for young people born just after or the end of the Cold War. What would you say to them about the relevance of NATO and the broader transatlantic security and defence community to their lives and their futures?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question, and actually you could argue it's easier to argue the case based on the last couple of years' experience than it would have been towards the end of the Cold War. But the world has always been an uncertain place. We always, in our policy documents, we always talk about the world being an uncertain place as if it's something new. But the world has always, for hundreds of thousands of years, been an uncertain place, and it will continue to be an uncertain place, unfortunately. And obviously, as a Brit, the security of the British people is important to me. And I think that you can't do that in isolation. You have to talk to others, whether it's in the context of NATO and the EU. But NATO is a successful organisation. It's well structured. The processes are clear. You can see at the breakdown of the Soviet Union, there was the nations that were formerly part of the Soviet Union were extremely keen to join NATO because they saw NATO as a force for good. It is very strong in that it's still, despite its large membership, it's still a consensus organisation, so everyone has to agree for something to happen. And actually, for the relevance for the UK, and I'd say this to younger people in the UK, the relevance is still there. I mean, the world, we don't have to point to exact examples, but we know the world's an uncertain place. We look, 360 degrees in NATO, and just about every direction you look, there is a potential threat or an existing threat to the security of Europe, to the security of the UK. And NATO is a very well established way of addressing those threats, together with the EU on some occasions, and not forgetting that NATO vitally provides a transatlantic link. And actually, post Second World War, this argument still applies, I believe, that transatlantic link with not just the US but Canada, of course, as well, is pretty important and relevant still, that we don't have an American continent that's disengaged from Europe, and actually we see our security as mutually entwined. And with globalisation, the way the world works now, that's arguably far more the case now than even it was at the end of the Second World War.
Speaking of America, during his recent state visit to the UK, President Obama appealed to the young voters to use their vote in the EU referendum in Britain for next month. As the US is the most important NATO member state, do you think he has that right to do that from a NATO's perspective, or was he, as many people in UK have argued, just interfered in domestic British politics?
Well, as the head of the world superpower, I think he's a right to say pretty much anything he wants to say. I guess there is an argument. I talked about the relationship between NATO and the EU before. I guess there is an argument that he would do so from a NATO perspective, but I guess also he'll do so from a US perspective, that his principal job is the security of his own US citizens, and he sees it in their best interest clearly that the UK remains a member of the European Union as well as of NATO. I guess you could argue it's interfering, but it's his job. We rely on the US to be engaged in Europe. That's part of what they do in NATO. So engagement equals interference, and it's hard to differentiate the two. It'd be pretty odd in some ways if the US president didn't have a view, and if he has a view that affects the security of the United States through their work with Europe, then I think he's entitled to express it, as he has done.
Since the end of the Cold War, the nature of the threats confronting the transatlantic community has changed radically. This so-called emerging challenges such as climate change, cyber warfare, counter-terrorism and counterinsurgency, and most recently, of course, the so-called hybrid warfare. Given that these threats go beyond the remit of national defence ministries, how, in your professional judgment, should NATO best play its part in this new security and defence environment?
I think this is a difficult question, and I've been deep into NATO's nuclear policy rather than some of these other emerging security challenges. But it goes back, I think, to what I said towards the beginning, which is that actually hard power and soft power have to be used together to ensure security. And the soft power issues, or the combination of hard power and soft power, when you get into climate change, energy security, cyber warfare, counterterrorism and so on, hybrid warfare, the definition of that, you get deeply into things that are not just a matter for defence and the sort of hard side of things. They're very much a matter for ministries of foreign affairs, I guess, development, whatever the development aims of different nations are, and very much into that area of overlap I talked to, or working together of NATO and the EU, those sort of hard and soft power mixtures, and the fact that we can sometimes best achieve our security requirements through a mixture of both, and that's achieved through a mixture, as I said, of hard and soft power, NATO and the EU. So all those areas you just mentioned, I think, are actually proof that some of these more modern challenges are best addressed by a mixed approach.
Of course, yeah. In the light of these emerging challenges, would Britain be safer, less safe, or about the same, again in your professional view, if Britain votes to leave the European Union?
I think, based on the arguments I've made, I'd have to argue less safe, but it's very difficult to put a sort of figure on that, or any sort of judgment. The judgment has to be fairly subjective. I think a bit less safe, because there would be less certainty. You'd be upsetting the mechanisms that currently exist and replacing them with unknown mechanisms. So although UK would be inside NATO, not the EU, which Norway is now, you could argue that, why would that affect our security? But overall, based on the arguments I've already made in this interview, I think I would have thought a bit less safe, but it's very difficult to explain all the arguments for that sort of judgment.
There is even more debate now than usual about the special relationship. In your view, is the special relationship between the USA and Britain as it was in the 1940s, or it is now between the USA and the whole of Europe, including the European Union, as if the latter? How would the special relationship be affected, in your view, by a British vote to leave the European Union?
Well, in my view, there are a few levels to the special relationship, and it's never been, I guess, clearly defined, or there are, perhaps better put, there are a number of different definitions. I came from the submarine world, and I think of the special relationship as based on, the intelligence relationship between the US and the UK, between the US and Britain. And I think that would remain the same. I think that is a well-established relationship, and coming from a submarine background, I'm very familiar with the close ties between the US and the UK in all those sort of areas. But the special relationship, I think, is wider than that. There is a special relationship on a sort of economic slant security point of view, in which, big and obvious nation, Germany is very deeply involved. Indeed. So there is, if the US president is looking at Europe and how to advance economic and security at the same time, and the two are interlinked, then Germany will be as big a player as the UK probably, and obviously with it working with Germany both within NATO and the EU, the UK has a voice in that relationship as well, which it would lose if it were to leave the EU, because it would obviously still be able to talk to Germany in a NATO context, but would lose that ability to voice a view in the wider EU context. And thus you can argue that bits of that relationship, it's a very tenuous thing to talk about, special relationship, but bits of that relationship would be lost.
And finally, for my last question, there is a great debate at the moment among the expat community here and throughout the EU about the unfairness of expats who have lived outside the UK for more than 15 years being denied the vote in the referendum, which could have an enormous effect on their lives. I am myself, just introducing myself, I am half British and can vote in this in this referendum, but also I'm half Italian. Now, being half Italian, I've never lived in Italy, but I can still vote in Italian elections. So which do you think is fairer, the British system or the Italian system?
I'm not sure really. I haven't thought about this much before because I am still, because of the amount of time I lived in Brussels, and the fact that my family lived in the UK, I'm a UK voter. In basic principle terms, I don't think you should have a vote in two places at the same time. So either you should have a say in what happens in Belgium, if you happen to decided to set your family up in Belgium, whether you're a Brit or not, or in the UK. The fact that actually a vote will have an impact on you, I don't think actually counts here. And this may sound strange, in relation to my previous views that I've expressed, personal views on the EU, but actually I think it's right and proper that a person has a vote in one place, and if they set up their home in Brussels, then they get a vote in Belgium, not in the UK. As I said, I'm in a privileged position from the point of view of this referendum, that I'm a Brit who happens to be living temporarily in Brussels, and I still get a vote in this upcoming referendum. So I hope that answers your question.
It has. Ian Stallion, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.